The Neighbor's Secret. Emma lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets were lined with identical houses, all with well-manicured lawns and white picket fences. Every house seemed to have its own story, but none were quite as intriguing as the one next door. The Johnsons lived there, a seemingly perfect couple in their mid-40s. Mr. Johnson was always seen heading to work in a sharp suit, and Mrs. Johnson tended to her garden, smiling at everyone who passed by. They seemed like the model neighbors, always polite and composed. But there was one thing about them that Emma couldn't shake. Something about their house felt different. While the other homes on the street were often filled with the sound of children playing, or the laughter of family gatherings, the Johnsons' house was always quiet. Too quiet. Emma couldn't help but feel that something was hidden behind the calm facade, something they didn't want anyone to know. It was a rainy Wednesday evening when Emma first noticed it. Mrs. Johnson hadn't been seen for several days. Normally, she would be outside every morning tending to her flowers, waving at Emma as she left for work. But this time, nothing. The garden looked untended, and the windows remained closed. Emma tried to brush it off, thinking perhaps Mrs. Johnson was on a trip, but something gnawed at her curiosity. The next morning, Emma saw Mr. Johnson leaving for work, his usual smile absent from his face. He walked briskly to his car, glancing around nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. His suit looked a little more wrinkled than usual, his hair less neat. Emma's concern grew, and she decided to check on Mrs. Johnson. After all, it was neighborly to make sure everything was okay. Later that afternoon, she mustered up the courage to walk over and knock on the Johnsons' door. She waited, heart pounding, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. As she turned to leave, the door creaked open ever so slightly. Emma froze, unsure of what to do. "Hello? Mrs. Johnson," she called softly, but the house remained silent. Her curiosity now fully piqued, she pushed the door open further, stepping into the hallway. The air inside felt cool and stale, as if the house hadn't been aired out in days. She glanced around nervously, her mind racing with all the possibilities of what could be going on. What had happened to Mrs. Johnson? Why hadn't she been seen? "Mrs. Johnson? It's Emma from next door," she called again, but only the sound of the rain outside answered her. Emma stood in the hallway, debating whether she should leave or call for help. But then she noticed something odd, a single pair of muddy shoes by the door. Mrs. Johnson was always meticulous about keeping her home clean, and Emma had never seen dirt tracked in before. It struck her as out of character. Without thinking, she stepped further into the house. As she walked down the hall, she noticed the pictures on the walls. They were all of the Johnsons smiling, laughing, and appearing as the happy couple everyone believed them to be. But the deeper she went into the house, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The furniture, while neat, appeared unused, as though no one had really been living there. A strange tension hung in the air. She approached the living room, and that's when she saw it, an envelope on the coffee table, addressed to Mr. Johnson. The letter was sealed, but there was something about it that drew Emma's attention. It looked worn, as though it had been read and handled several times. She knew she shouldn't, but her curiosity got the better of her. She reached for the letter and gently pulled it open. The words inside made her heart race. It was from Mrs. Johnson, and it was a farewell letter. "Dear James," it began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I can't live this lie any longer. The truth has been eating me alive, and I can no longer pretend that everything is okay. I've been keeping something from you, something that I thought I could take to my grave, but I can't. I've made arrangements to leave before it's too late. Please understand that this is not about you. It's about me, and the person I've been hiding from the world for so long. I hope one day you can forgive me for what I've done." Emma's hands trembled as she put the letter back down. What secret had Mrs. Johnson been hiding? Where had she gone? And why had she felt the need to leave so suddenly? Her mind spun with questions, but she knew one thing for sure: Mrs. Johnson wasn't coming back. Just as she was about to leave, she heard a noise from upstairs. A soft, shuffling sound. Someone was still in the house. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed toward the staircase. She knew she shouldn't investigate, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to know what was going on. Slowly, she ascended the stairs, each creak underfoot making her nerves tighten. The sound grew louder as she reached the top. It was coming from the bedroom. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob and turned it. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the faint light coming through the drawn curtains. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Mr. Johnson. His face was buried in his hands, and he looked utterly defeated. The sight of him, once so composed and confident, now reduced to a man broken by whatever had happened, filled Emma with a mix of sympathy and fear. "Mr. Johnson," she whispered. He looked up, startled by her presence. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and for a moment they stared at each other in silence. "She's gone," he said, his voice hoarse. "She left without telling me the truth." Emma didn't know what to say. She felt like an intruder in this moment of vulnerability, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't leave him like this. "I found her letter," Emma admitted quietly. "What happened?" Mr. Johnson sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know. She never told me what was really going on. She just disappeared." There was a long pause, the weight of the unspoken filling the room. Emma realized then that whatever Mrs. Johnson's secret was, it had consumed her to the point of leaving everything behind. "I thought we were happy," he whispered, almost to himself. "I thought I knew her." Emma left the house that day feeling a deep sadness. She realized that even the people we think we know best may carry secrets, hidden behind smiles and polite conversations. The perfect picture of the Johnsons had shattered, leaving behind unanswered questions and the haunting reminder that sometimes people can hide entire lives from those they love most. As she walked back to her house, the rain still falling softly around her, Emma couldn't help but wonder, what was Mrs. Johnson's secret, and why had she chosen to leave it all behind?
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.